What if I told you that the most powerful people you know never reveal exactly how they make their money? Picture this. You know someone who constantly posts about their income, shares every business detail, and brags about their financial wins on social media. Now picture someone else who's clearly successful, nice lifestyle, calm confidence, obvious wealth, but you have absolutely no idea what they actually do for work. Here's what's crazy. The second person almost always has more real power, more peace, and ironically, more money than the first one. While everyone else is performing their success for an audience, the truly wealthy are protecting something far more valuable than money itself. Most people think transparency equals authenticity, but successful people understand a deeper truth. Discretion is the ultimate power move. Information has become the new currency, and every time you reveal how you earn, you're literally giving away pieces of your power to people who may not have your best interests at heart. I'm about to reveal 10 reasons why keeping your income sources secret isn't about shame, it's about strategy. And the 10th reason? It'll completely change how you think about privacy and power. Hit subscribe and comment silent power if you're ready to discover why mystery beats transparency every time. But that's just the obvious part. What I'm about to reveal will shock you about human nature. Point 1. Silence as strength. Most people have it completely backwards about silence. They think if you're not talking about your money, your success, or your strategies, it means you're either hiding something shameful or you don't really have much to brag about. But here's what they don't understand. Silence isn't a sign of weakness, it's the ultimate display of strength. But that's just the surface. What's behind it will startle people. Let me tell you about 2 neighboring kingdoms that faced constant threats from raiders and rival armies. Both kingdoms were wealthy and prosperous, but they chose completely different approaches to protecting their treasures and maintaining their power. The first kingdom believed in transparency and openness. Their castle had massive windows that showcased the golden treasures within. The gates were always open, welcoming visitors to tour the royal treasury. The king would proudly display his wealth, explaining in detail how he'd accumulated each piece of gold, every precious stone, and all his valuable artifacts. "Look at what we've built," he would declare to anyone who would listen. Visitors were constantly amazed by the impressive displays. Word spread quickly about the kingdom's riches, and soon everyone in the region knew exactly what treasures lay within those transparent walls. The king felt validated by all the attention and admiration his openness brought. The second kingdom took a radically different approach. Their castle appeared modest from the outside, strong walls, but no windows revealing what lay within. The gates were solid, opening only for invited guests. When visitors asked about the kingdom's wealth, the king would smile politely and simply say, "We do well enough." No tours, no detailed explanations, no showcasing of treasures. When the inevitable attacks came, the difference became stark. Raiders knew exactly what to target in the first kingdom. They had detailed mental maps of where every valuable item was located. They struck with precision, knowing exactly what to steal and where to find it. The transparent kingdom suffered devastating losses because their openness had become their vulnerability. Meanwhile, attackers approaching the second kingdom found themselves confused and hesitant. They didn't know what treasures awaited them or where they might be located. This uncertainty made them cautious, and many decided the risk wasn't worth the unknown reward. Here's what that story reveals about your financial life. When people can't access your inner world, your strategies, your income sources, your financial details, they simply can't disturb your peace or interfere with your progress. Here's where most people make their biggest mistake without even realizing it. Point 2. Mystery equals power. In our age of constant sharing and digital oversharing, there's something incredibly magnetic about a person who doesn't reveal everything. Someone who maintains an air of mystery naturally commands more respect, more curiosity, and ultimately more power than someone who lays all their cards on the table. Don't jump to conclusions, because what comes next changes everything about power dynamics. In the grand theater of an ancient city, there worked 2 magicians who both possessed extraordinary skills. Both could perform incredible feats that left audiences speechless. But their approaches to their craft revealed everything about the nature of power and influence. The first magician was generous with his knowledge. After every performance, he would stay behind to explain his tricks to curious audience members. "The secret is in the sleeve," he'd reveal, showing exactly how he made objects disappear. "The trick box has a hidden compartment here," he'd demonstrate, opening the concealed panels for everyone to see. He believed that sharing his knowledge made him more respected and appreciated. Initially, people were fascinated by these revelations. They would gather around, eager to learn the mechanics behind the magic. But something unexpected happened over time. Once the audience understood how every trick worked, the magic disappeared entirely. The performances became predictable. People would attend his shows not to be amazed, but to spot the techniques they already knew. His mystique vanished, and with it, his power to truly captivate. The second magician took a completely different approach. After each breathtaking performance, when audience members begged him to reveal his secrets, he would simply smile mysteriously and bow gracefully. "A magician never reveals his secrets," he would say with quiet confidence, then disappear backstage as enigmatically as the tricks he performed. This maintained an aura of wonder around everything he did. Audience members would leave his performances still talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed, trying to figure out how he'd accomplished such impossible feats. They returned show after show, not just for entertainment, but hoping to finally understand the mystery. His reputation grew, not despite his secrecy, but because of it. Years later, the first magician was performing at children's birthday parties, while the second had become a legendary figure whose performances commanded premium prices and packed theaters. Here's what that story teaches about your financial life. When people can't figure out exactly how you've achieved your success, they approach you with more respect, more caution, and more genuine interest than if you'd simply handed them a step-by-step manual. I'll tell you something that took me decades to understand about wealthy people. Point 3. Peace protection. The moment you start sharing details about your income, your investments, or your business strategies, you sacrifice something far more valuable than money itself: your peace of mind. Most people don't realize this until it's too late, but financial disclosure destroys the very tranquility that makes wealth enjoyable in the first place. This next part separates those who stay wealthy from those who lose it all. In a bustling city filled with noise and chaos, there existed two gardens that served as retreats for their owners. Both gardeners had worked for decades to create these sanctuaries, but they had very different philosophies about sharing their peaceful spaces. The first gardener was proud of what he'd built and wanted everyone to appreciate his creation. He installed viewing windows along every wall, posted signs describing each rare plant and expensive feature, and welcomed anyone who wanted to tour his garden. He even published detailed articles about his gardening techniques, the costs of his installations, and the value of his rare specimens. Soon, his garden became a popular attraction. Visitors came daily to admire, photograph, and discuss his achievements. Many would point and whisper about the expensive koi pond, calculate the cost of the imported stones, and debate whether certain plants were worth their price. Some visitors were genuinely appreciative, but others came with envy, criticism, or ulterior motives. The constant stream of commentary gradually poisoned the garden's atmosphere. The gardener found himself constantly defending his choices, explaining his expenditures, and managing the opinions of people who had never built anything themselves. What had once been his peaceful sanctuary became a source of stress and judgment. The second gardener created an equally beautiful space, but surrounded it with tall, elegant walls that offered only glimpses of the beauty within. When people asked about his garden, he would smile and say, "It's a simple place where I find peace." He never detailed the costs, never explained his methods, and never opened it for public viewing. This gardener's sanctuary remained exactly that, a sanctuary. When he entered his garden each evening, he found genuine tranquility. No one questioned his choices because they didn't know what those choices were. No one calculated his expenses because they couldn't see his investments. His peace remained intact because his privacy protected it. Here's what that story reveals about your financial life. Your peace is your most precious currency, and the fewer people who know your financial details, the stronger that peace becomes. All of the above becomes meaningless if you miss this crucial detail about human psychology. Point 4. Information as weapon. In today's world, information has become more valuable than gold, and people don't just trade goods or services anymore. They trade knowledge, gossip, secrets, and data. Every time you reveal details about your income sources, you're essentially handing out ammunition that can be used against you in ways you never anticipated. What I'm about to share will make you rethink every conversation you've had about money. In the shadowy world of international espionage, there once worked two highly skilled agents who had access to equally sensitive information. Both possessed secrets that could shift the balance of power between nations, but their approaches to handling classified intelligence revealed everything about survival in a dangerous game. The first agent believed in building trust through transparency. When meeting with contacts, he would share operational details to demonstrate his credibility. "Here's how we infiltrated their network," he'd explain, showing his methods to prove his competence. "This is our source inside their organization," he'd reveal, thinking that openness would strengthen his relationships and enhance his reputation. Initially, this approach seemed successful. His contacts were impressed by his willingness to share valuable intelligence. But as time passed, a dangerous pattern emerged. The information he'd shared began appearing in the wrong hands. His methods were being used against him. His sources were being exposed. Other agents started replicating his techniques, making his unique skills commonplace. Worse yet, some of the people he'd trusted with sensitive information began using it to advance their own agendas, sometimes directly opposing his missions. His generous sharing had armed potential enemies with the exact knowledge they needed to outmaneuver him. The second agent operated by an entirely different code. When asked about his methods, he would smile and give vague responses. "Trade secrets?" he'd say with a knowing look. When pressed for operational details, he'd redirect conversations toward general principles rather than specific tactics. He understood that his value lay not in what he revealed, but in what he kept hidden. This selective sharing protected not just his methods, but his entire operation. Competitors couldn't replicate what they didn't understand. Enemies couldn't counter strategies they couldn't anticipate. His discretion became his greatest asset, allowing him to operate effectively for decades while others burned out quickly. Here's what that story teaches about your financial life. Every detail you share about your income sources becomes intelligence that others can use to compete with you, copy you, or undermine you. You're about to discover why the smartest people seem almost boring on the surface. Point 5. Psychology of wealth perception. Here's a fascinating truth about human psychology. When you're struggling financially, people rarely ask questions about your situation. But the moment you start showing signs of success, cleaner shoes, elevated energy, subtle confidence, suddenly everyone becomes curious about your methods. This shift reveals something profound about how wealth changes social dynamics. The following story reveals a truth that most people learn too late in life. In a prosperous kingdom, there lived a wise ruler who understood the dangerous psychology of revealing wealth. This king had learned his lesson through observing the fate of his predecessor, and the contrast between their approaches was striking. The previous king had been open about the kingdom's prosperity. Whenever the royal treasury grew, he would announce it publicly, explaining in detail how the wealth was accumulated. He'd host elaborate festivals showcasing the kingdom's riches, believing that transparency would earn him respect and admiration from neighboring rulers and his own subjects. But an unexpected phenomenon occurred. When the kingdom was struggling, neighboring rulers had shown sympathy and offered assistance. However, once the king began revealing his growing wealth, everything changed. Former allies suddenly became calculating. They would visit not to offer friendship, but to assess what they could gain. Some began making unreasonable demands, expecting generous gifts simply because they knew the kingdom could afford them. Even the king's own advisors changed their behavior. They began approaching him with increasingly expensive proposals, justifying their requests by pointing to the kingdom's obvious wealth. "Surely you can afford this," became a constant refrain. The king found himself constantly defending his spending choices and managing expectations he'd created through his own revelations. The wise new king learned from this pattern. When his kingdom began prospering under his leadership, he chose a different path. He maintained the same modest appearance, continued living simply, and when asked about the kingdom's finances, he would smile and say, "We manage well enough." This discretion allowed him to control the narrative around his wealth. Because people didn't know the extent of his resources, they continued treating him with the same respect they'd always shown, rather than the calculating interest that wealth revelation typically triggers. His advisors made reasonable proposals rather than inflated ones. Neighboring rulers maintained genuine relationships rather than transactional ones. Here's what that story teaches about your own financial journey. The moment people know you have money, they begin doing mental calculations about what you should be able to afford, what you should be willing to share, and how you should be living. Here's where psychology meets strategy in the most powerful way. Point 6. Teaching versus sharing process. There's a critical distinction that separates wise mentors from people who sabotage their own success through oversharing. You can teach principles and inspire others without handing over your personal blueprint. Understanding this difference protects both your competitive advantage and your relationships. But there's something deeper happening that few people recognize. In an ancient mountain monastery, there lived two master craftsmen who were both renowned for creating extraordinary works of art. Young apprentices would travel from distant lands seeking to learn their secrets, but these masters had completely different approaches to sharing their knowledge. The first master believed that complete transparency showed true generosity of spirit. When students asked about his techniques, he would demonstrate every step of his process in precise detail. "First, I gather clay from this specific hillside at dawn," he'd explain, showing them the exact location. "Then I knead it for exactly 47 minutes using this particular motion," he'd continue, demonstrating his unique hand movements. "The firing temperature must be precisely 1847 degrees, and here's the secret mixture I add to create this unique glaze." His students were initially grateful for such detailed instruction. However, within months, these apprentices were creating works nearly identical to his masterpieces. Soon, the market was flooded with copies of his style. His unique artistic voice became commonplace, and his once premium prices plummeted because anyone could replicate his exact methods. The second master took a fundamentally different approach. When students came seeking knowledge, he would teach them universal principles. Understanding balance creates harmony in your work. Patience during the process yields strength in the final piece. True artistry comes from expressing your authentic vision, not copying others. He would demonstrate concepts rather than techniques, inspire creativity rather than imitation. His students learned to think like artists, not to follow recipes. They developed their own unique styles while applying the timeless principles he shared. Years later, the first master found himself competing with dozens of craftsmen using his exact methods, while the second master remained uniquely positioned as the source of wisdom that inspired others without diminishing his own value. Here's what that story reveals about sharing your financial knowledge. Teaching principles. Patience, discipline, consistency. Empower others while protecting your specific advantages. But sharing your exact process, your specific income sources, your particular strategies essentially creates competition for yourself. The real secret lies in what successful people refuse to do. Point 7. People measure and judge. Human beings are wired to evaluate and compare everything around them, especially when it comes to success and money. The moment you reveal your income or business details, you inadvertently invite people to measure you against their own situation, and this mental mathematics rarely works in your favor. Most people get this backwards, and it costs them their peace. In a small village, nestled between rolling hills, there lived a community where everyone seemed obsessed with measuring and comparing each other's success. The village had an old tradition. a wooden measuring stick that hung in the town square, which residents would use to compare the height of their crops, the size of their harvests, and eventually the value of everything they owned. One farmer in this village was particularly successful. His fields produced abundant crops year after year, and his innovative techniques consistently yielded impressive results. Initially, he was proud to share his achievements. He would tell anyone who asked exactly how much his harvest was worth, which methods produced the best yields, and how much profit he made each season. But something troubling began happening. Neighbors started using that village measuring stick in ways he'd never anticipated. They would stand in the town square, comparing his reported earnings to their own struggles. Some felt inadequate and became resentful. Others felt he should be contributing more to community projects, since he obviously had the means. Still others began making financial requests, justifying them by pointing to his publicly known prosperity. Even worse, people began auditing his lifestyle. They would notice when he bought new equipment and question whether it was necessary. They'd comment on his family's clothes, their meals, even their travel plans. If he can afford that, they'd whisper, surely he should be able to help with this community expense. The farmer realized that by revealing his financial details, he had essentially handed everyone in the village a measuring stick to judge every aspect of his life. His success had become public property, subject to constant evaluation and commentary from people who had never built what he'd built. Meanwhile, another equally successful farmer in the village had learned to smile and simply say, "We do well enough for our needs," when asked about his finances. This farmer enjoyed the same prosperity, but without the scrutiny, expectations, or social complications that came with financial transparency. Here's what that story teaches about sharing your wealth details. The moment people know your numbers, they begin measuring your choices against those numbers, and suddenly your private decisions become public debates. Here's the part that sounds counterintuitive, but makes perfect sense when you understand. Point 8. Internal vs. external validation. The most profound shift that happens when you stop sharing your financial details is that you begin deriving satisfaction from your own achievements rather than from other people's reactions to them. This transformation from external to internal validation is perhaps the most powerful benefit of financial discretion. This is the moment where everything clicks about why certain people command respect. High in the mountains, there lived two climbers who had both achieved extraordinary feats. Both had conquered some of the world's most challenging peaks, but their relationships with their accomplishments revealed entirely different approaches to fulfillment and validation. The first climber was addicted to recognition. After every successful expedition, he would rush back to town to share detailed accounts of his adventures. He'd post photographs, give interviews, and explain precisely how he'd conquered each difficult section. The admiration and amazement of others became his primary source of satisfaction. He measured the value of each climb by how impressed people were when he described it. This dependency on external validation created a dangerous cycle. When people were impressed, he felt successful. When they seemed uninterested or questioned his achievements, he felt diminished. He found himself planning expeditions not based on personal challenge or growth, but on how spectacular they would sound when he shared the stories. His climbing became a performance for an audience rather than a personal journey. The second climber took a radically different approach. He climbed the same challenging peaks, experienced the same triumphs, and overcame the same obstacles. But when he returned from expeditions, he would simply smile and say, "It was a good climb," when people asked about his adventures. He didn't photograph every moment or document every achievement for public consumption. This climber found deep satisfaction in the private moments. The sunrise from a peak that few humans had ever seen, the quiet pride of pushing through mental barriers, the personal growth that came from facing fear and uncertainty. His validation came from within, from knowing what he'd accomplished and how it had changed him. Years later, when both climbers reflected on their careers, a stark difference emerged. The first climber felt empty despite all the recognition he'd received, constantly needing new achievements to feed his validation addiction. The second climber felt fulfilled and content, carrying within him a quiet confidence that needed no external reinforcement. Here's what that story reveals about your relationship with financial success. When you stop seeking approval for your wealth-building achievements, you begin enjoying them more deeply and authentically. The next principle will explain why silence often speaks louder than words. Point 9. What to share instead. If you're not sharing details about your income sources, investments, or business strategies, what should you talk about? The answer lies in understanding the difference between sharing wisdom that elevates others versus sharing information that exposes yourself to unnecessary risks and complications. What happens next in this story changed how I view wealth forever. Along the banks of a great river that nourished an entire valley, there lived two communities that had very different relationships with the life-giving waters that flowed past their settlements. Both communities depended on the river for survival, but their approaches to sharing its gifts revealed profound wisdom about generosity and boundaries. The first community believed in complete transparency about their relationship with the river. They would take visitors to see their exact water collection points, showing them precisely where they drew their drinking water, where they gathered the special clay that made their pottery valuable, and where they found the unique stones that formed the foundation of their prosperity. They shared detailed maps, specific techniques, and even the timing of seasonal changes that maximized their harvests from the river. While their openness was initially appreciated, it created unexpected problems. Other communities began competing for the exact same resources, overusing the specific locations and disrupting the delicate ecosystem that had sustained abundance for generations. The transparency that was meant to help others ended up diminishing the very resources they'd been trying to share. The second community took a different approach. Instead of revealing their specific methods and locations, they shared the universal principles of living in harmony with the river. They taught visitors about reading water patterns, understanding seasonal flows, and respecting the balance between taking and giving back. They shared wisdom about patience, observation, and sustainable practices that could be applied to any water source, anywhere. Most importantly, they spoke about the deeper lessons the river had taught them. The value of consistency, the power of going with natural flows rather than fighting them, and the importance of preparing for both abundance and scarcity. They shared ideas that elevated thinking rather than detailed information that invited competition. This approach enriched conversations and relationships while protecting their specific advantages. Visitors left feeling inspired and empowered with principles they could apply to their own situations, rather than armed with information they could use to replicate or compete with their host's specific methods. Here's what that story teaches about sharing your success. Focus on principles that lift people higher. Patience, discipline, long-term thinking, value creation. Share wisdom that opens minds, not details that invite comparison or competition. This final principle ties everything together about the true nature of power. Point 10. Discretion as wisdom. The ultimate truth about keeping your financial methods private isn't about secrecy, shame, or superiority. It's about understanding that discretion is the highest form of wisdom, the ability to distinguish between what should be shared and what should be protected for the greater good of everyone involved. The final story I'm about to share reveals why this matters more than you think. In an ancient civilization renowned for its vast libraries and accumulated knowledge, there existed two approaches to protecting and sharing the most valuable wisdom that had been collected over centuries. The scholars who managed these treasures faced a constant dilemma: how to make knowledge accessible while preserving its power and preventing its misuse. The first group of guardians believed that all knowledge should be freely available to anyone who requested it. They opened their most sacred texts to any visitor, sharing the precise formulas for creating powerful medicines, the exact strategies that had built their civilization's wealth, and the detailed processes that had taken generations to perfect. Their philosophy was noble. Knowledge belongs to humanity. However, they soon discovered that unrestricted access led to unexpected consequences. Some visitors took the medical formulas and created inferior, dangerous versions that harmed people. Others used the wealth-building strategies selfishly, creating imbalances that damaged communities. The detailed processes were replicated without the wisdom and experience needed to apply them responsibly, leading to failures that discredited the original knowledge. The second group of guardians developed a more nuanced approach. They readily shared foundational principles: the importance of observation, the value of patience, the power of ethical behavior. They taught visitors how to think critically, how to develop wisdom, and how to apply universal truths to their own unique situations. But the specific formulas, the detailed processes, the exact methodologies, these were shared only with those who had demonstrated the wisdom and character to use them responsibly. This wasn't about hoarding knowledge. It was about ensuring that powerful tools remained in capable hands. Over time, the second approach proved far more beneficial to humanity. It created a world where people developed their own capabilities, rather than simply copying others' methods. It prevented the misuse of powerful information while still spreading wisdom that could improve lives. Here's what that story reveals about your financial discretion. Protecting your specific methods isn't selfish. It's wise. It prevents others from making costly mistakes by trying to replicate what they don't fully understand, while still allowing you to share the principles that can genuinely help them build their own success. True power lies not in what you reveal, but in what you wisely choose to protect. There you have it. 10 profound reasons why the smartest, wealthiest people you'll ever meet never reveal exactly how they make their money. From silence as strength to discretion as wisdom, each principle reveals the same truth. Protecting your financial information isn't about shame or secrecy, it's about strategic power. When you master the art of graceful non-disclosure, you protect your peace, maintain your competitive advantage, and command respect without having to prove anything to anyone. You become magnetic not because of what you say, but because of what you wisely choose not to say. Your challenge this week: practice responding to financial questions with elegant vagueness. Try phrases like, "I do a little of this and that," or "we manage well enough." Which principle resonated most with you? Drop a comment with your go-to response when people ask about your income, and tell me which of these 10 reasons hit home the hardest. If this video changed how you think about financial privacy, smash that subscribe button and share it with someone who overshares their financial details. Remember, let them wonder while you build quietly, intentionally, powerfully.